Everyone, my name is Cho. I'm the founder and sole tutor at Impetus LSAT. And in today's video, we're going to be continuing our discussion about quantifiers. So if you haven't seen part one of the quantifier video, I would highly recommend checking it out. I'll provide a link for you here somewhere because there's some essential concepts there that you need to understand in order to understand this particular video. Okay, and by the way, if you are enjoying this content, please make sure to like and subscribe because I'll be providing additional content about quantifiers as well. We're going to go super in depth. We're going to understand all the ins and outs in the next series of videos. And then from there, we'll also talk about other essential LSAT concepts as well. But in this particular video, what we're going to talk about is how to diagram quantifiers and also what you can and cannot infer based on each individual type of statement. Now, keep in mind that as far as diagramming goes, you don't need to diagram every single quantifier that you come across. In fact, pretty much every single statement is a quantifier. So if you end up diagramming every single one, you are probably going to end up wasting a lot of time. And so whether you should or should not diagram is also partially subjective because keep in mind that the LSAC, they're not testing you on your diagramming ability, right? It's not if you diagram something incorrectly, they're going to dock points or anything like that. But having a correct diagram can help you better understand the passage and better understand the implications of the statements. Okay, so again, it is partially subjective, but there are some good guidelines and principles to follow to help you determine whether you should diagram in situations where maybe you're not so sure. The first thing to consider is the complexity of the statement. How well are you understanding it, right? Now, just like with any statement, if you have difficulty understanding it, it might be a good idea to diagram something. Sometimes even just doodling something on your scratch paper can be extremely helpful to help you visualize what's going on in the passage. So if you have difficulty understanding a statement, it might be worth your while to diagram. The second thing to consider is whether these statements are linkable, right? So if you see conditions that are being repeated or that link up with one another, then in that case, it might be worth diagramming because if statements link up, then there's a very good chance that there's something you can infer from it. And that's exactly what the LSAT will frequently test you on is, are you able to identify and understand these particular inferences? So again, if you are able to form inferences based on linking statements, it is probably a good idea to diagram because sometimes there's going to be a lot of different details that you have to keep track of, and there's going to be multiple inferences that you can make. And doing all of that mentally is pretty challenging for most people. Okay, so let's jump right into it. Let's talk about the various different types of quantifiers. So we're going to start out with this first statement, all dogs are friendly. Now, I know that in everyday life, we know that this isn't true, right? There are some dogs that are just not very friendly, but it doesn't matter. Okay, in the LSAT world, if this is stated to us, we just take it as a fact. We don't question it. Okay, keep in mind that also this is talking about 100% of dogs. And if you recall, we talked about how that is an absolute statement. If you're talking about 100% of something, it is absolute. And we also talked about how if you are talking about 100% of something, it is also a conditional. Okay, and so if you haven't checked out my conditional reasoning statements, if you're not familiar with conditionals, I would highly recommend checking out my blog posts about that. But here's how to diagram a conditional. Whatever you're talking about 100% of is going to be on the left side, and then the remaining portion is going to be on the right side of the diagram. Okay, so this is saying that this condition on the left, which is also called the sufficient condition, is triggering this other condition. It's guaranteeing it. Okay, so now that we understand what this diagram means, let's take a look at what we can and cannot infer, which, by the way, keep in mind that it doesn't matter whether we said every dog is friendly or all dogs are friendly or any dog is friendly, etc., right? All of those are still referring to 100% dogs. So the diagram is still going to be exactly the same. So all those quantifier terms that I included in the absolute column from the first video would be diagrammed in exactly the same way as this particular statement. So again, jumping back into what we can and cannot infer, of course, we know that if something is a dog, it must be friendly based on the statement. But what if it's not a dog? Now, a lot of times people make the mistake of assuming that if this condition doesn't happen, this condition or the necessary condition also doesn't happen. And that's just not necessarily true. Notice how, based on this statement, I actually don't know anything about other animals, right? What if it's a cat? Maybe the cat is friendly. Maybe cats aren't friendly. We just don't know, right? So that means that if the sufficient condition fails, we simply do not know what happens to the necessary condition. It's completely up in the air. Okay, and that's super important to understand. Now, what if something is friendly? Okay, if something is friendly, we're satisfying our necessary condition. But if it's friendly, does it automatically mean that it's a dog? No, for the same reason, right? Maybe cats are also friendly. So then in that case, if it's friendly, it could still be a cat. But it also could be a dog, right? And so once again, we just don't know. Okay. So notice how if the sufficient condition fails, we don't know what happens to the other. We can't say that the other condition also fails, which would be called a mistaken negation. And then you also can't go in the opposite direction. You can't say, oh, if the necessary condition happens, the sufficient condition must happen. That's called a mistaken reversal. Okay. But last but not least, what if something is not friendly? Okay. If something isn't friendly, then there's actually no way it could be a dog. Okay, that it would actually be impossible. Because again, we know that every single dog is friendly. Now, this is called, again, the necessary condition. The reason why we call it the necessary condition is because it's something that needs to happen if the sufficient condition happens. And we use the word need all the time, but we don't really think about what it means, right? A need essentially means if you remove it, you got to remove the other thing, right? Like, for example, like I need water to survive. That means if I don't have water, I'm not going to survive, right? Or we need to take the LSAT to go to certain law schools. That means if we don't take the LSAT, we're not going to go to those particular law schools, right? That's what a need means. And so that's why this statement logically follows because I'm removing the need, which means I have to remove the other thing. Okay. And it's important to understand that these two are equivalents of each other. They're not negations, they mean the same thing. They're just two ways of saying the same thing. Okay. So now that we understand that, the next thing to remember is if you recall, we talked about in the last video how you can always go from stronger language to weaker language. If I had, if all dogs are friendly, it logically follows that most dogs are friendly. That has to be true. Because remember, we said most means anything greater than 50%. And of course, 100% is greater than 50%. And if all dogs are friendly, it also logically follows that some dogs are friendly. So those are things that we need to keep in mind. Let's move on to the next statement. Okay, what if most dogs are friendly? Now remember, of course, this doesn't mean that necessarily all of them are, but they could be. It's possible that 100% dogs are friendly, we're just not sure. But just because it's possible doesn't mean I can diagram the same way as a conditional, right? Because there's still a difference in meaning here. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to still have dogs, but I'm going to put an M above the arrow. That's going to indicate most. But remember, we said we're going to diagram all terms that fall under the same level of strength the same way. Just like how up here, like whether this was an all or an every or an any, it would still mean the same thing, so the diagram doesn't change. So the same thing for strong language, right? So whether we have most dogs are friendly or dogs are usually friendly or dogs are typically friendly, we're still going to diagram it in the same way. Okay, so next up, let's play around with the implications. Now, just like with the conditional, I can't do a mistaken negation. I can't say that most things that are not dogs are not friendly. That would be incorrect. Also, just like with the conditional, I can't do a mistaken reversal. I can't say that most things that are friendly are dogs. That would also be wrong. Okay. But here's where it differs. Unlike conditionals, I cannot do the contrapositive. I cannot say that most things that are unfriendly are not dogs. That would also be wrong. Okay. And the reason for that is because a most statement doesn't necessarily indicate a need. And remember, we said the reason why we could the reason why we could say up here that if it's not friendly, then it's not a dog is because it needs to be friendly in that particular statement. But in this particular case, again, it's not a need. So that's why we cannot immediately contrapose. Okay. Now, from the statement, we should also keep in mind that some dogs must be friendly as well, right? Because we said, again, we can go from stronger to weaker, but we can't go from weaker to stronger. So just because most dogs are friendly, of course, that doesn't mean that all dogs are necessarily. Okay. Another thing to be very careful about, though, is a lot of times people think this means that some dogs are not friendly. And that's very frequently how the LSAT's going to try to trick you. That is not necessarily true because, once again, it's possible that all of them are. So if all dogs are friendly, it doesn't necessarily mean that some of them aren't. Okay. Moving on, we have some dogs are friendly. And let's do a little thought experiment. So let's say we have dogs, okay? And part of my terrible illustration here, but let's just pretend that these circles represent dogs, okay? And for whatever reason, there's only 8 dogs in the world, okay? Now, if some of them are friendly, what would be the bare minimum that needs to be friendly? It would be 1. Because remember, some just means greater than 0. The smallest number that is possible then is 1. So let's just pretend this is our friendly dog, right? He's happy, he's friendly. Now, what's interesting here is if you notice, this also means that some friendly things are dogs as well, right? Because it just takes one friendly thing, being a dog, in order for us to draw that inference. So some, unlike most and all, actually can be reversed. So we can actually say this. Okay, so for some arrow, it actually points in both directions. And again, remember, some, many, often, they all fall under weak language, so they're all going to be diagrammed in exactly the same way. Couple things to keep in mind here. We can't contrapose a sum. So keep in mind, contra are solely reserved for conditionals. So that means I can't say that some things that are not friendly are not dogs. I can't say that some things that are not dogs are not friendly. All of those would be incorrect. I also can't say that some dogs are not friendly. That would also be wrong because, once again, some includes the possibility of all. So it's still totally possible that all dogs are friendly. Okay? In which case, it wouldn't be true that some dogs aren't. And same idea here, I can't say that some friendly things are not dogs either. It's totally possible that dogs are the only friendly things in the world, okay, based on this statement. So again, these are the crucial things to understand. And so it's still worth understanding why we can't derive certain inferences. But the really important thing, just a general rule of thumb to remember, is you cannot do anything with quantifier negations, right? I can't, as soon as I'm negating one of these conditions with the quantifier, that's a major red flag, right? So jumping back up to this most statement, right? So this is a quantifier. If I had some dogs are not friendly, that's wrong because I'm negating a condition. Some things that are not friendly are not dogs. That would also be wrong. Most things that are not friendly are not dogs. That would also be wrong, right? So that's a simple way to think about it. And same thing for the some statement, right? Some dogs are not friendly. I'm negating a condition. That's going to be wrong. Some things that are not dogs are friendly. Also negating a condition. That's also going to be wrong, etc. Right? So that's a simple rule you can follow, but you still need to understand why we can't follow those particular rules as well. Okay, so that's about it for now. Next video, we'll talk about some of the more complicated quantifiers, We'll also start talking about how to chain quantifiers, how to make inferences based on multiple quantifier statements, things of that nature. So make sure to stay tuned.